So let's turn our attentions to the Tomb Worlds once more, and in the current edition of Warhammer 40K, which units are the strongest in the army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons, and with quite so many big changes in Warhammer 40K, I thought it would be worth revisiting Necron army lists to see what the best players are running. Necrons in 40k have been doing well enough since this Arks of Omen season came out. It's kind of been an interesting time for Necron army lists. Their objective rules were drastically reined in, with worse secondary objectives, plus that combo of the objective secured pre-game move dynasty is gone. But Games Workshop gave out quite a lot of buffs as well as took stuff away. Lots of their data sheets went down in points, sometimes quite drastically. And although they had a bit of a blip where the Silent King didn't really work with a lot of dynasties in the Arks of Omen detachment, they have now fixed that, so he's back on the table in full force. In terms of overall army strength, they're doing kind of alright, 48 to 49% win percentage, a fair few high placing lists in big tournaments, and 2 grand tournaments won so far in Arks of Omen. Generally good news for the army. In this video though, I thought we'd talk about what's hot for the Necrons right now, and do a top 10 of some of the strongest units in the Necron Codex, things that you're more likely to see in army lists created by the best players around. With that in mind, I thought we'd apply just a little bit of data to this. I looked at 18 high-performing Necron army lists, things on best coast pairings that either went 4 or 1 or better at a grand tournament, or 3-0 at smaller tournaments. It shows which units are commonly appearing in army lists, at least in the lists that are doing well, and I feel like it's quite a good rough and ready metric for which units are best in the army. Obviously the best units are going to vary a bit depending on your dynasty and your playstyle, but I think it's still quite a helpful way to look at things. So let's talk through the best units in Codex Necrons right now, and what makes them strong. First up, a fair few units that did get selected a fair few times but didn't actually make it into the top 10. I'd rate all of these units as pretty usable, but maybe not the most commonly selected things due to competition from other choices. These things were all selected at least 3 or more times out of those 18 good lists that I looked at. In the 3-unit selection, we've got the Doomsday Ark, fairly reliable and cheap firepower. They did go down in points cost and seems to be far better than the Doomstalker at the moment, which wasn't played at all in any of them. There's both the Lich Guard and the newly cheaper Triarch Praetorians here, both of which I think are solid enough, but maybe aren't manning the battle line compared with Destroyers quite so much. There were 3 Night Sides on the board, which I think largely due to the aircraft changes are almost entirely there for that prismatic dimensional breach. Deep strike them turn 2, and then use the stratagem to jump out a unit right next to the enemy for a near guaranteed charge. It is quite a power play. A trio of HQs, including Amrakir the Traveller, who is a rather good overlord with the +1 to hit, the Lokhust Lord, and the Necron Lord. I guess the Lokhust Lord's rerolls are quite nice with things like Lokhust and Skorpekh Destroyers, perhaps not too hard to see why he is there. The Necron Lord could get you a cheap Resurrection Orb if needed, and also some easy rerolls. Immortals seem to be a bit out of vogue compared with the new cheaper warriors, still present occasionally, and more often to be selected in armies that don't get army-wide objectives secured like Nihilak. Ghost Arcs are a bit of a maybe choice for warriors, some lists run them, many don't, and a couple of cheap Cryptothralls are fairly popular alongside a Cryptek, either just a derp cheap unit to do actions and things on objectives, or can provide a little bit of melee damage if you are moving your Cryptek up alongside the army. Otherwise, for higher selections out of the top 10, on 4 selections we've got the Monolith, which again got a big points drop and it's quite popular with the Death Rays. Wraiths as fast moving and tough units, though perhaps a bit outcompeted by the other fast attack at the moment, and the Catacomb Command Barge, which seems to be the way that you'd want to field a generic Overlord at the moment, though again it doesn't seem to be particularly mandatory in Arks of Omen. Finally, only 5 lists chose to run a Catan of some sort. The Transcendent was the most popular with 3 selections, but also the Deceiver, Nightbringer, and Void Dragon were all used exactly once. Kind of depends on exactly what extra things you want to add to the army, I guess. Canoptek Spiders tend to be popular in armies that have a fair few Scarabs, often just taking 1 or 2 of them, maybe with some Particle Casters, and perhaps a Gloom Prism for some Psychic Denial. Getting into the top 10, and first up we start out with 4 different units that were actually tied for 9th place, so I guess this is technically a top 12 actually. In 7 army lists we have the Necron Warriors, much improved in Arks of Omen. They dropped down from 13 points to 11, and it managed to keep them as a solid durable battle line for the army. Prior to the change I did think they were a bit underwhelming for their cost. They're reasonably tough with their toughness 4, 4+ save, and the boosted reanimation rules, and they are quite a good target for things like Resurrection Orbs, or all manner of different buffs like the Veil of Darkness. Typically I want to equip the Phalanxes with a close range Gauss Reaper, 2 shots at 12 inches with a strength 5 and AP -2. It does outdamage the Gauss Flare by quite a bit against just so many targets, and some lists chose to run either 10 or 20 warrior blocks. The 20 blocks tended to be the ones supported by things like Resurrection Orbs, Chronomancers, and Overlords perhaps. A couple of the 10 strong blocks made use of Ghost Arcs to get them into the midfield. Nice to see that they're not irrelevant, even though troops aren't mandatory in Arks of Omen and Necrons get OBSEC everywhere. They definitely got a much needed points drop, and I feel like they wouldn't have been taken much if they hadn't. Also tied for 9th is perhaps a slightly surprise entry as the Hexmark Destroyer. It does seem that these guys are genuinely somewhat popular now. Lots of top lists are using them and using them well. I don't think I saw any list that ran more than one of these. But basically what you get is a 65-point model that can deep strike and then blaze away at the enemy with those disintegrator pistols. A flurry of shots that hit on 2s re-rolling 1s, hitting at strength 6 and AP -1, and each time you slay a model you get an extra shot, so more chance for more damage. I feel like perhaps the resurgence might be partly due to Armour of Contempt going away. It did make that AP -1 just very sad against a good cluster of armies out there. Plus the increased use of Strategic Reserve might be a bit helpful for them. They do have that intercept rule where they can just jump in and blaze away at a squad that just came out of reserve. They're definitely still going to be stronger against certain armies than others. Things like Orcs, Harlequins, or other Eldar really aren't going to want to see these on the board. They'll quite happily demolish a fairly expensive infantry unit, no questions asked, and might be kind of hard to counter-attack due to character protection. Could be interesting enough for secondary objectives like behind enemy lines if you needed them as well. Doesn't hurt for that. Otherwise they could also be interesting with the Gauntlet of the Conflagrator. A fair few lists chose to run that. That's the anti-horde one where you might get an extra mortal wound or 2 each time you fire. Particularly good against any units with say 20 models in them. Cool to see these guys genuinely being used competitively. They are a very cool model in my opinion. Also tied on 9th place we have the creepy Flayed Ones, basically 10 point per model melee warriors without the troops or innate obsec, though admittedly they will be gaining that back if you take in the popular Nihilak dynasty. They don't get the boosted reanimation that the standard warriors do, but they are a little bit cheaper at 10 points. In combat they'll flense you away with their flare claws, strength user AP -1 and damage 1. 3 attacks with that, and they get exploding 6s against infantry, which is pretty nice. They're also super strong in Novok where you get a bit more AP, and again I feel like they're a unit that's really profited from Armour of Contempt going away, as that AP -1 is more consistently usable now. I feel like Flayed Ones are an interesting enough unit that you can either run them as small squads or go quite big on them if you want. Small units of 5 can just be annoying and disruptive, particularly with their objective secured jumping down in the opponent's deployment zone, but I did see at least one list that went absolutely crazy on them. 3 big squads of 20 models supported by character buffs. They'll be kind of similarly hard to remove as warriors when they're obsecking on the midfield objectives with Nihilak, and potentially work quite nicely with certain character buffs, say Anrakir the Traveller for an extra attack. The main downside of course is the price from Games Workshop. They are kind of hideously expensive. I'd be tempted to try and convert them from cheaper warriors if it were me. Lastly, with our units with 7 selections and tied on 9th, we have the Ophydian Destroyers. Again, perhaps a unit that's been a little bit on the weaker side more or less since it came out, but in Arks of Omen, again, they do seem to have got a bit more of a lease of life. I feel like these guys might be seeing a touch more play as Space Marines are back in force. A whole flurry of AP -3 damage 2 attacks is pretty awesome if you're fighting any sort of standard power armor. These guys have a fair few similarities with Skorpekh Destroyers. They move a little bit faster and aren't quite as tough to kill, but they do have some very nice supporting rules. Innate deep strike and the ability to go back into it with their tunneling stratagem, plus whip coil bodies for a -1 to hit in combat. Canoptek plasma sights are pretty popular to run alongside them as well. 15 points for some extremely buffed melee for either these guys or Skorpekh seems to be well worth it. In a lot of army lists they don't seem to be run in enormous amounts, perhaps 1 or 2 units with 3 to 5 of them in for more sort of troubleshooter units. They usually do tend to be more Skorpechs on the field than these guys. Again though, I do think it's pretty cool that they're doing so nicely. Very nice sinister Necron models reminiscent of the old Wraiths. Moving onwards and upwards in the world, tied in 7th place we have the Silent King and one other unit, though I would bear in mind that in reality the Silent King should be ranking higher on this list. There will be a fair few successful tournament armies that chose not to play him, as he had that brief period where you couldn't take him outside of the Zarakan dynasty, before Games Workshop decided to amend their army construction rules in an FAQ. The Silent King has been borderline auto-include territory for Necrons for quite a while now, though I'd perhaps argue perhaps a little bit less so since he lost core. Previously he had it until mid-season in the Nephilim season if I remember right. Still though he remains very solid and usable. He's a great centerpiece to have in the middle of the army. Pretty tough with his decent invul and 26 wounds in total. You can't ignore him at range with 2 enormous damage 6 beams coming out. He allows nearby units to reroll their hit roll, particularly nice with Lokhust Destroyers, and particularly with that Gauss weapon stratagem, and he allows 4 rerolls to wound in melee as well, pretty brutal with things like Skorpekh Destroyers or even Flayed Ones. When he's in combat he's certainly no slouch either, he makes the enemy fight last, which is quite a powerful ability, and plus he strikes out with 3 different flavours of attack from him and his other Triarch members. He even gives you a bonus 3 command points as well, which is pretty awesome when you're only starting on 6 with army construction normally. There's a lot of reasons to run Mr. Zarek the Silent King, and he is definitely a competitive Necron unit, underrated on this list. I suspect if he hadn't had the blip where you couldn't field him, he'd be much higher. Moving on though, and also tied on 7th, we have the Technomancer. He's a 70-point Cryptic HQ choice, who is the guy who heals your warriors basically. Typically he seems to be most commonly fielded with that Canoptek cloak, giving him a bit more movement to get where he needs to go. And the best thing about him is either healing 1 core model or D3 warriors each turn. If you do lose any big expensive destroyers or things, then you're going to very quickly make back any value that you paid for him just in dangerous models returned to the board. If your opponent leaves squads half killed, you could be setting up a 30-point Skorpekh Destroyer right on the front lines, and potentially even at the front of the unit to help make their charge shorter and allow them to reach their intended foe. It's pretty awesome with just Lokhust Destroyers and things as well. Restoring a Lokhust Heavy Destroyer is 50 points returned to the board, and that's some serious value when he only costed 70 points to begin with. The cloak also gives you added value, regenerating a few wounds as well. You can give him Cryptek Arcana and Warlord traits and things, which is always handy. And there is the option of the Canoptek control node as well, which some lists do make use of. There were a couple that made some good use of Spider's shooting with a whole bunch of particle shots. Overall, I just think he brings a lot of value for his 70 odd points. In 6th place we have the Lokhust Heavy Destroyers. These guys are 50 points per model and are often fielded with their big scary anti-tank shots. The Gauss Destructors pack a single heavy one-shot at strength 10, AP -4 and damage 3d3. Not really a profile that just about anything in the game can ignore, unless it's light infantry that don't really care about losing a model. Their defensive profile certainly isn't spectacular for the points, but they can generally hover at a fairly decent distance and maybe outrange at least a few enemy threats. They might be handy for a unit that's helpful to stick close to the Silent King for some hit rerolls, while slogging out some really big anti-tank. Some lists just chose to field them as individual models for fast and annoying units that are hard to deal with individually. Some people built out to units of 3, and to give you the potential for healing them back with Technomancers, or potentially using them as the targets of stratagems like the reroll wounds one for destroyers if you wanted it, or more focused buffs like My Will Be Done. Overall, can't really argue too hard with a big anti-tank shot that's got the potential to kill something like a Dreadnought in a single shot if you get very lucky. They're pretty efficient if you just get a wound or 2 through against heavy infantry as well. You should be removing entire models in 1 shot each time. In 5th place we have perhaps one of the most improved units for the Necrons in Arks of Omen. The Tomb Blades were taken in 11 of the 18 lists, so we're getting into over half of the list taking these now. Despite some decent competition in the flash attack slot, they are very popular. 18 points per model now, down from 20, and these Necron jet bikes are just all round solid, fast moving with a big 14 inches and can advance for more. Pretty tough to kill with toughness 5, 2 wounds and an innate -1 to hit, very helpful. And for the points cost, just their base particle beamer seems like a very nice deal to me. 6 shots at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Definitely going to be a lot less useful against heavily armoured targets, but these guys will smash light infantry pretty efficiently. For the majority of units that I saw, they tended to typically be taken in pretty small units, usually 3s or 5s to zoom out to midfield objectives. Pretty handy to have these units winging around with objectives secured. They can just reach targets a long way away and potentially punish enemy infantry units trying to take them. Again, a couple of armies did build out as well. You could definitely give some big buffs to them like My Will Be Done. I guess perhaps their biggest weakness is getting locked in close combat, which wouldn't be good for their damage output. A couple of people I saw use Shadow Looms or Shield Veins as well to get a 5+ invul or 3+ armor save. A Shadow Loom or 2 in the unit seems kind of usable. If you do get shot by high AP stuff, you might well save a bike or 2. I guess they'd be pretty solid in Mephrit as well with extra AP up close. And they've got a 1 command point stratagem for fractal targeting to allow you to advance and still shoot without penalty, which is kind of fun. Moving onwards, and 4th on the list of most commonly played Necron units are Lokhust Destroyers. Some of the last of the old school Necrons with the Gauss green rods. They started out kind of weak and overcosted in Codex Necrons, but having had their points cut and getting core, They really turned into one of the stars of the codex, with shooting that's effective against most things. The standard destroyers cost 40 points, have toughness 5 and 3 wounds, which is kind of okay toughness for a firepower unit. They blaze away with their Gauss cannons, 3 shots at 24 inches, strength 6, AP 3, and damage D3. I'd say it's a profile that's usually going to be okay against most things. It's particularly nice against Space Marines and heavy infantry. Damage D3 tends to be fairly efficient into 3 wound infantry, which are quite popular in Warhammer 40K. For the most part, people tended to build Lokhust Destroyers into quite a big unit, often taking a large number of them, usually with a Lokhust Heavy Destroyer, who only costs 5 points more in this unit. You really can go quite heavy on stratagems for them and get some very efficient damage dealing. They can reroll wound rolls for 2 command points. I really quite like the Gauss auto wounds on 6s as well, which pairs amazingly with Silent King rerolls. And some lists I've seen use the Veil of Darkness to get line of sight on a critical enemy unit turn 1 in the game. These guys do have the potential for a pretty devastating alpha strike. Again, for weaknesses, maybe not the unit that you want to get wound up in combat. They do have some slightly shorter range than some, with 24 inches on the main Gauss cannons, but just overall a very solid and dangerous firepower unit, great for any big synergies and buffing rules. In third place on our list of top Necron units, we have the Chronomancer. Out of 18 army lists, 14 Necron lists chose to take one of these guys along. It seems that almost everyone feels that getting an invulnerable save on an important unit is just too good to pass up. The Chronomancer is one of the Cryptek HQ choices, 75 points for a buffing support character. Not really any sort of enormous combat stat line, but he does actually have some fairly interesting shooting, either with the Entropic Lance or Aeon Stave. The Lance I think is fairly worth it for a 10-point upgrade, a single anti-tank shot with a big damage D3 plus 3. It won't always do anything, but when it does, the opponent will certainly feel it. The real reason to take him though is his Chronometron buffing rule. In your command phase, select a dynasty unit within 6 inches. It will give you them a 5 plus invul save and allow them to re-roll the charges. After the 2 rules, I think that the 5 plus invul really is quite a big thing. It's an absolutely excellent survivability boost to certain Necron units. Perhaps the single best and most annoying beneficiary is actually Canoptek Scarab swarms. They don't get much for a save in the first place, so putting them up to a 5 plus invul save with all those wounds is just super annoying for the opponent to remove. The bonus to charges certainly doesn't hurt on a unit that's going to be zooming up into the midfield either. Besides them though, there really are so many other good targets out there. It's great on the Necron Warriors, who've only got a 4 plus save to start with. It's very nice on Flayed Ones. It's pretty awesome on Skorpekh Destroyers as well, who are more likely to get targeted by high AP anti-tank weapons, so we'll often be saving on that. And again, the reroll charges is pretty handy. I think as a support character, he's also a particularly nice place to put any warlord traits or relics that you might want to buff your army with. He's a good place to store any Cryptek Arcana, say like the Hypermaterial Ablator to give your units cover as well, for yet more defense. It's a nice choice for the Veil of Darkness to jump alongside a unit round to another part of the board. You can put down a Necron unit in an area that's very threatening, and that unit's going to be additionally tough. And if you wanted to try and charge out of Deep Strike with them, you also get to re-roll that distance, making it far more reliable. With that one, you could also give the +1 to charge Warlord trait for him. That would further double down on that tactic. And it's just quite nice for units starting on the board as well, giving you multiple ways to make your charge threat range longer. Overall, a really solid little Necron HQ, using the power of time to confound your opponents apparently. Finally, moving into our top 2 units. First up, we have perhaps the slightly unsung heroes of the Canoptek Scarab swarm, almost in auto-include territory for Necron army lists it would seem. 15 out of 18 of the army lists ran at least some of these little guys, though admittedly numbers of them really varied from list to list. Some armies just literally ran 1 or 2 small units of 3 of them, say in Nihilak for some objective secured nuisances in the midboard. Some armies ran multiple units of 5 of them, perhaps for a bit more support for things like Chronomancers. And again, there were some Necron army lists that just went very heavy on them and actually used them as a primary melee threat. I did see one Novok list that took multiple big units of 8 or 9. They can actually get fairly savage with the Novok buffs when they go off. In any case, the Scarab swarms are 15 points per base. You get a whole bunch of little bugs with toughness 3 and 4 wounds per base. 4 attacks as well, but they do only hit on a 4 plus and don't get any AP at base. They do get a small buff against tougher things as they auto wound on hits rolls of 6s. Being fast units with fly, having a low profile and a whole ton of wounds are a whole load of good things going for them. Typically they aren't usually going to be the best damage dealers in the army, though as mentioned in Novok they certainly will chew through things in large numbers. But just for cheap 45 point squads that move quickly and are hard to kill, I think you're going to be hard to beat them for the value. I guess perhaps one of the bigger downsides is that if you run a whole ton of them, you might start giving up a fair few points for no prisoners. If you did run a big squad of 9, that's 36 wounds killed if the enemy does manage to wipe the unit, though admittedly they'll probably have to do a fair bit of focus fire to do so. Overall, certainly a unit that you don't have to feel too bad about fielding in the army. It does seem that a fair few Necron army lists tend to build around the fast attack section of the Arks of Omen. It's either that or elite, but with basically every single fast attack choice in the codex being very usable, with Tomb Blades and Scarabs being perhaps particularly standout, it's not too hard to see why. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the single most selected unit out of any of these top army lists, and it looks like every single list bar one chose to run at least some Skorpekh Destroyers. I must admit this isn't really a choice that surprises me too much. Ever since their points cost dropped to 30 points, plus they gained the core keyword, they have basically been some of the most efficient damage and defense battle lines of the Necron army, and they aren't even that slow either, moving 8 inches per turn as well. Your 30 points gets you a toughness 5 3 wound destroyer with a 3+ save, reasonably tanky for that cost, and if and when they catch up with you in melee, they do hit very hard indeed. A big scary hyperphase Reap Blade hitting at strength 7, AP 4 and damage 3, and a whole bunch of attacks from the Threshers at AP-3 and damage 2. Again, they're particularly good against elite infantry. Things like Space Marines will feel the charge of these guys and often have entire squads wiped. There are a lot of ways that you can support them to get better than that as well. Plasma sites are very popular in lists that go heavy on these. Plus you could use Disruption Fields for a +1 strength. That's quite a nice boost as well. I must admit I do really like their defensive stratagem as well for a -1 to wound. For 1 command point, it's a great survivability boost when you're targeted by just about literally anything, but perhaps particularly so if the attacks coming at you are strength 5 or less. It means that you're wounding on a 5+ or a 6+, and that's almost never going to be efficient. Often people who run these tend to run multiple squads, and often in 5s tends to be a fairly popular number. That way that you're not dealing with any coherency issues, and you're not more vulnerable to blasts and things. In slightly bigger numbers, they can be quite efficient for character boosts as well. Things like My Will Be Done for the 2+ to hit, or the Chronomancer boost getting the 5+ invul save, and also reroll charges into combat, which is pretty nice for them. I saw a few units that were being delivered by Night Sides, I think, as well. Put them in strategic reserve and then use Prismatic Dimensional Breach to basically guarantee a turn 2 charge when the transport turns up on the enemy front line. Overall, definitely a hard unit to beat at the moment. Brutally efficient melee damage, and really quite cool models that are fairly easy to get a hold of at the moment due to starring in the starter sets. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a brief tour through some of the strongest Necron units in Codex Necrons. Let me know your thoughts and experiences with them on the battlefield, and are there any units that you think are underrated and might start to pick up a bit when people catch on to how good they are. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.